As we walk the journey of Holy Week, I suppose the thing that I focus the most on is a simple promise. And that is whenever we think God is the farthest away from us, whenever we believe we are in a situation now that is literally God forsaken, that's when God is closest to us. That God joins us in our suffering and embraces us in our suffering and leads us through those things. Even though it would be tempting to believe that in moments of suffering, this is God's abandonment of humanity. That in fact, it's the exact opposite. That God makes a decision in Jesus to join humanity in our lives, in our joys, and in our sorrows, and our sorrows and in our suffering. And in fact, Holy Week is a ritual reenactment of God's decision to join us in our suffering. Reminds me of a letter that a father wrote to Martin Luther back 500 years ago. And Luther would get all kinds of correspondence because he was a pretty prominent figure. So people would ask him all kinds of questions. And in this one episode, this father writes a letter to Luther. And he's worried about his son. And he thinks that his son is losing his faith and he's falling into despair and all of these sorts of things. He's using the ideas that they would have had 500 years ago about what all that means. And so he writes to Luther and he's like, I'm so afraid that my son is not only losing his faith, but he feared that his son wouldn't physically survive this episode in his life. And Luther's response was, whenever we feel that God is the farthest away from us, that's when God is closest to us. And what he tells this father, he says, remember the story of the passion of Jesus entering into the suffering of humanity. And at that moment, it would be easy to believe that God's nowhere. Like, where is God? Even the words from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He said, hold on to that. Because at that moment, that's when God's will is being fully given to humanity. That God has made a decision to destroy suffering and death and pain and evil and sin and all those sorts of things. That God always gets the last word. So he says to this father, this moment, as desperate as it looks, you need to understand that your son is not losing his faith. That your son is being embraced by God. And God is as close to your son in his suffering as God will ever be. And that's what Holy Week is to me. Holy Week is our ritual reenactment of the story of God's entering into our suffering. Through the passion of Jesus into the resurrection, we recall our own suffering and our own passions and our own desire for resurrection. And maybe even, if I can say this, we remember in our past the resurrection moments that we've already experienced. Especially at a time like this, I think it's important for us to embrace what Holy Week is, to embrace this idea that whenever we believe God is the farthest away from a situation, that's when God's the closest, whether it be on the cross or whether it be in your life or anything. Whenever we think that somehow we are in a situation where death and suffering and sin and evil will have the last word, we remember the 3 holy days, that there is a time that we might experience death and suffering and evil and pain, but experiencing those things doesn't mean that they have a victory over us. That, in fact, it is in those moments where God is most intimately involved in our lives, leading us from pain and suffering into brand new life. And so join me, join whatever community you wish, or in the silence of your own heart, and embrace this Holy Week journey as we recall the idea that when we believe God is the farthest away from us, that is when God is the closest to us. And when we find ourselves in a situation where we think God cannot be here, that's where God is the most present. And I hope in your life and in our world that we embrace this journey through suffering into the Easter promise, that God always gets the last word. Not death, not sin, not evil, not whatever you want to call those forces in our lives. Those forces never get the last word. God does. And I believe that's God's promise to us. So I hope you have a wonderful, meaningful journey through these holy days. And I hope you embrace the Easter promise that is certainly yours.